Polaji, do you see her? Do you see her? See who?
What is your name?
Before you scroll away, let me tell you something true. Near Ibadan, there's a crossroads that does not appear on any map. And the old men who still remember it will not walk through it after dark, not even to save an hour on their journey home.
If you reach that crossroads at midnight, the exact midnight, not a minute before or after, you will meet a woman sitting on a low wooden stool, as if she has been waiting for you her whole life. She will greet you kindly. She will ask you softly, almost sweetly, what your name is. And here is the thing nobody in that village will tell a stranger for free. Whatever name you give her, in that moment, at that crossroads, becomes true. Not just spoken, true. If you give her your real name, something of you stays behind at that crossroads forever, and you go home a slightly smaller person than you left it. But if you are clever, if you are quick enough to give her a name that was never yours to begin with, she rewards you instead more generously than any market woman could ever pay for cloth. Nobody agrees on why she asks. Nobody agrees on what she truly is. But everybody in that village agrees on one thing. It happened first to a boy named Tunde Adewale Fashina on a rainy night in 1958 on his way home from his uncle's funeral. And what happened to him is the reason mothers in that village still teach their children a second name before they ever teach them their real one. A quiet name, a name for strangers, a name for the road. Some say the story has softened over the decades, the way stories do when they pass from grandmother to grandchild 60 times over. Some say the woman was not a woman at all, but something that only wears the shape of one when it wants something from you. But everyone who has heard the story agrees on the ending, and they agree on the lesson buried inside it. A lesson about what you owe the truth and what you are allowed to keep for yourself. Stay with me. By the end, I'm going to ask you a question too, and I want to know in the comments what name you would have given her. Let's begin. Picture the road the way it was in 1958, not the tarred road, honking road of today, but a red earth path that ran between farms and cocoa groves, lit by nothing but moonlight and the occasional kerosene lamp carried by a traveler in a hurry to be somewhere safer. Tunde was 14, the second son of a respected farming family on the edge of the village. He was not the boldest of his brothers, nor the loudest, but he was by far the most careful. The kind of boy who checked twice before he crossed a stream, who remembered every warning his grandmother had ever given him, word for word, long after his older brothers had forgotten them entirely. And his grandmother, Adewale Fashina, had given him one warning more than any other, so often that it had worn a groove into his memory the way water wears a groove into stone. She told him from the time he was small enough to sit on her lap, "There are two names in this world that belong to you. The name your father calls you at the dinner table and the name you carry for the road. Never confuse the two. Never give the road name at the table, and never, never give the table name to the road." Tunde had always nodded and never fully understood. It was the kind of warning that lived in the same drawer of his mind as "don't play near the well" and "don't whistle after dark." Old wisdom, half believed, mostly obeyed out of habit rather than fear. Until the night his uncle died and Tunde was sent walking home alone later than any boy his age should have been walking anywhere. Tunde's uncle, a kind, laughing man named Babarotimi, had died suddenly of a fever that no one in the family fully understood, and the funeral rites stretched long into the evening, drumming, weeping, the slow, heavy business of sending a good man properly into the next world. By the time Tunde's father finished the last of the obligations that fell to the eldest men of the family, it was nearly 11 o'clock, and Tunde, exhausted and a little frightened by the drumming and the wailing he had watched all day, was told to walk ahead with his cousin Bolaji to the family compound, while the older men stayed behind to finish the rites. Bolaji, 3 years older and considerably braver, insisted on taking the shortcut, the path that cut through the old crossroads instead of the long way around by the main road. "It will save us 20 minutes, Bolaji said, already walking, and Uncle Rotimi is not going to rise up and scold us for it." Tunde hesitated. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his grandmother's voice stirred, faint but insistent, although he could not remember exactly what it was warning him about. He almost said something. He almost turned back. If you have ever had a small, quiet feeling tug at you and talked yourself out of it because the alternative felt embarrassing, then you already know exactly how Tunde felt, standing at the edge of that shortcut, torn between his cousin's confidence and his own uneasy silence. He said nothing, and he followed Bolaji into the dark. The crossroads, when they reached it, looked exactly the way it always had. 4 paths meeting at a wide, flat clearing, an old cotton tree standing at its center, its roots thick and knotted above the ground like the fingers of something very old and very patient. Bolaji, walking quickly, barely glanced at it, but Tunde slowed without quite meaning to, and it was in that slowing that he saw her. A woman sat on a low wooden stool at the base of the cotton tree, exactly where no stool had been a moment before, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she had simply always been sitting there and the darkness had only just now decided to let Tunde see her. Her cloth was a deep, unbroken black, without pattern, without shine, the kind of black that seemed to swallow the little moonlight that reached the clearing rather than reflect it. Her head was uncovered, her hair combed into 100 tiny plaits, each one tied off with a small white thread that caught the moonlight even though nothing else on her did. Tunde whispered, "Bolaji, do you see her?" Bolaji turned, followed his cousin's gaze, frowned at the empty base of the cotton tree and said, "See who?" Bolaji, unable or unwilling to see what stood so plainly in front of his cousin, grew impatient and walked on ahead, muttering about boys who let a funeral get into their heads, promising to wait for Tunde at the far edge of the clearing. And Tunde, rooted to the spot, found that his feet would not carry him forward until the woman had finished with him. Though nothing about her had raised a hand or spoken a threatening word, she simply looked at him, patient as the cotton tree at her back, and waited. "Good evening, my son," she said finally, and her voice was warm, almost motherly, the kind of voice that made a boy who had spent the whole day surrounded by grief want badly to be comforted by someone. "You have had a long, sad day. Sit with me a moment." Tunde did not sit, but he did not run either. "I should catch up to my cousin, Ma." "Of course," she said, unbothered. "Just tell me your name first and you may go." It was such a small request, such an ordinary one. People ask children their names all the time. Market women, teachers, elders at church, uncles he had never met before today. There was nothing on the surface dangerous about the question at all, and that, Tunde would later understand, was exactly the danger of it, that it wore the shape of the most harmless question in the world. But somewhere underneath the tiredness and the grief and the 11 o'clock darkness, his grandmother's voice surfaced at last, whole and clear, the way a name surfaces when you've almost forgotten it. Never give the table name to the road. Tunde's real name, the name his father called him at the dinner table, the name written in the family Bible, the name his mother had whispered over him the night he was born, was Adetunji. Tunde was only ever what people called him for short, but even a short name spoken at the wrong crossroads, at the wrong midnight, to the wrong listener, could be enough of a thread for something patient to pull on. So, Tunde did the only thing his grandmother had ever taught him to do in a moment exactly like this one. He reached quickly into a small store of nonsense names every village child kept ready for exactly this purpose, the kind of joke name older cousins gave each other, the kind of name that meant nothing and belonged to no one. He said, Ojoro. It was not a real name. It was in fact a small village joke. Ojoro meant cheat, and it was what boys called each other when they lost at Ayo and refused to admit it. He half expected the woman to laugh at him, or worse, to see straight through the lie and be angry. Instead, something in her face changed, not anger this time, but something closer to delighted surprise, the way an elder's face changes when a small child says something unexpectedly clever. Ojoro, she repeated slowly, testing the shape of the false name in her mouth. A cheat's name for a cheat's hour. She tilted her head. Clever boy, cleverer than most who crossed this road at midnight. Tunde felt his knees go weak with relief, certain the worst was over. But the woman did not tell him to go. Instead, she arose from her stool, unfolding upward far too smoothly, far too silently for a woman who had looked a moment ago perfectly ordinary, and took one slow step toward him. Since you did not give me your name, Ojoro, I will not take anything of yours tonight. That is the bargain, and I do not break bargains, not even with children. Her dark eyes glittered in the moonlight. But you did not run from me either. You did not scream, you did not throw stones the way frightened boys usually do. You stood and you answered carefully. That too is worth something at this crossroads. She reached into the folds of her black cloth and withdrew a single white thread, identical to the ones tied into her hair, and held it out to him. Take this, she said. Not as payment, I owe a false name nothing, but as a gift freely given for a boy who kept his wits about him on the worst night of his week. Tie this white thread around your wrist, and the road will always know you as a friend of the crossroads. No thief will trouble you on a night walk. No storm will catch you too far from shelter. No fever will find you the way it found your poor uncle today. And here is where the story could have ended simply, the way a lesser story might. A clever boy, a fair test passed, a small reward given and received. But Tunde, exhausted, grieving, and still not entirely sure he wasn't dreaming the whole encounter, hesitated with his hand halfway to the thread, remembering, just in time, the second half of his grandmother's warning, the half he had never fully understood until this exact moment. Please, Ma, he pulled his hand back. What will the thread cost me if I wear it? The woman went very still, and for the second time that night, something shifted in her face. Not anger this time, but something almost like respect, deep and old and entirely unhurried. Nothing tonight, nothing this year, but a gift accepted without question is a debt waiting to be named later, whether it costs you a season or a lifetime. You are wise to ask, small cheat. Wiser than the man who raised your uncle's own father 60 years ago, who took a gift much like this one without asking and spent the rest of his life paying a price he never understood in ways he never connected back to the crossroads at all. She lowered the thread, considering him. Very well, I will tell you honestly, since you asked honestly. The thread costs only this. One day, far from now, the crossroads may call on your household for a small kindness in return. Nothing more than that. Not a life, not a name. A kindness freely given when it is asked for, the same way I am freely giving you this thread tonight. Tunde thought of his uncle buried that very afternoon before he had the chance to grow old and tired and full of stories. And he thought of the long walk still ahead of him and the darker, longer walks that were sure to come in a life spent farming land that bordered forest and fed on rain that did not always arrive on time. And he thought too of his grandmother, who had not once in 14 years given him advice that turned out to be wrong. I accept, he said, and I thank you for explaining it honestly, Ma. The woman smiled, a real smile this time, warm enough that for one strange moment she looked less like something out of the dark and more like an aunt he simply hadn't met yet, and tied the white thread around his wrist herself, her fingers cool as pond water even in the warm night air. Go home, Ojoro. Your cousin is waiting and worrying, though he will never admit either to you. When Tunde turned back to thank her properly, the base of the cotton tree was empty. No stool, no woman, only roots and moonlight, and the distant, impatient sound of Bolaji calling his name from the far edge of the clearing. 9 years passed the way years do, filling themselves quietly with school and farming and the ordinary business of growing up, until Tunde, now a young man, married with a small daughter of his own, had almost entirely folded the memory of the crossroads into the same drawer as every other half-believed childhood story. Until the Harmattan of 1967, when his daughter, not yet 2 years old, fell ill with a fever that no herbalist in the village could name or cool, a fever that climbed through the night no matter how many cold cloths her mother pressed to her small burning forehead. By the third night, with the nearest hospital 2 hours away by a road no driver wanted to risk in the dark, Tunde sat outside his house under a moon nearly full enough to read by, and found his hand drifting, without quite deciding to the thin white scar of thread mark still faintly visible on his wrist after all these years, worn smooth by 9 harmattans and 9 rainy seasons. The crossroads may call on your household for a small kindness in return, not a life, not a name, a kindness freely given when it is asked for. He did not know that night whether he was calling in a debt or simply grasping at the last thin thread of an old, half-forgotten comfort. But he walked, alone, the 20 minutes to the crossroads under the cotton tree, and he called out, not a name this time, he still did not know her true name and perhaps never would, but a simple, honest request, spoken aloud to an empty clearing, the way a man speaks to a grave he still isn't sure can hear him. You told me the crossroads might one day ask my household for a small kindness, he said. I am asking first. My daughter is dying. I am asking for a kindness in return for the one I showed you 9 years ago when I answered your question honestly instead of running. The clearing was silent for a long moment. Then, from somewhere close to the roots of the cotton tree, a voice he remembered exactly, unhurried by 9 years the way Tunde himself had been hurried by every single one of them, answered him. You still ask before you take, the voice said, warm with something that might have been approval. Go home, Ojoro. Your daughter's fever will break before the cock crows. Consider the debt between us settled, and do not come looking for a second favor. The road is patient, but it is not endlessly generous.
Tunde walked home in the dark without any real proof that anything had changed, half convinced he had simply talked himself into hearing what he needed to hear. But by the time he reached his gate, his wife was already at the door, her face streaked with tears that had shifted sometime in the last 20 minutes from grief to disbelief. Their daughter's fever, unbroken for 3 days, had snapped as suddenly as a fever ever does, leaving the child sleeping soundly, damp with sweat, but cool to the touch, breathing easily for the first time since the fever began. Tunde lived a long life after that harmattan, and he taught every one of his children, the daughter whose fever broke and the 3 who came after her, the same 2 lessons his grandmother had taught him. Never give the road your table name, and never take a gift from the road without asking first what it will one day cost you. He never told them in so many words exactly who or what waited at the crossroads near the old cotton tree, only that it was owed a certain kind of respect, and respect, more often than fear, was what kept a family safe on a dark road. His children grew up half believing the story, like most village children do, as a bedtime story first, and only later, if they were paying close attention to the small, careful habits of their father, as something closer to instruction. The old people near Ibadan still tell this story today, though, as with all such stories, the details shift depending on who is telling it. Some say it happened in 1958, some say a few years later. Some say the crossroads has since moved the way old roads sometimes do when new ones are built beside them. But the heart of the story never changes. A boy was asked an honest question at a dishonest hour, and because he answered carefully instead of confidently, and asked instead of assumed, he walked away with a debt worth having rather than a debt worth fearing. That is the nature of the crossroads. It does not punish a careful tongue. It only punishes a careless one. If you ever find yourself walking a quiet road after midnight anywhere in this world, and a stranger asks you kindly what your name is, remember Tunde. Remember the thread on his wrist. And remember that the safest answer is rarely the true one, and the safest gift is always the one you ask the price of first. Before you go, a question for you. If a stranger you met on a lonely road at midnight asked you for your real name, and something in your gut told you not to give it, what would you do? A. Give a false name immediately and hope that's the end of it. B. Refuse to answer at all and walk away without a word. C. Ask the stranger why they want to know before deciding anything. D. Give your real name. It's just a name. What's the worst that could happen? There's no single correct answer here. Every choice carries its own risk and its own kind of wisdom. But Tunde's story suggests that the safest path is rarely the boldest one, it's the careful one. Drop your answer in the comments, A, B, C, or D, and tell me why. And if this one gave you chills, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and stay close, because next time we're going back to the water, to a fishing town on the creeks near Bonny Island, where something in the river has started answering to the names of the drowned. Until then, the road remembers, neither should you.